Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for attending today's Wednesday webinar wisdom segment. My name is Hannah Scherer. I'm the Director of Customer Success here at BigMarker. And today's session is all about webinar hosting mistakes, mistakes that you might even be making yourselves, and even if you're not, how to avoid them in the future so that they don't happen. I'm going to post in the chat now the blog post that we've written about this subject, and then this Wednesday webinar wisdom segment is actually an extension of the blog post. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And before we go over the agenda topics, just a little housekeeping before we actually dive into the meat of today's webinar is covering the kind of format of these Wednesday webinar wisdom segments. So these segments are typically 20 to 30 minutes in length. They're pretty short. They cover a very niche topic within the webinar hosting space. And then we open things up at the end for a live Q&A session. And also, just by attending one of these sessions, you do get 30% off for your first 3 months of BigMarker. So stay tuned as well for that coupon code. But without any further ado, like I said, let's just dive right in. So the agenda that we're covering today is, again, these webinar hosting mistakes that you're probably making and how to essentially avoid them. So exactly what we're going to be covering today. First, we'll be going over the 5 most common mistakes that most webinar hosts make, and then also kind of covering and going through those mistakes and going through kind of like a checklist, how to avoid future webinar hosting mistakes so that you don't keep, continuously making these mistakes, or if you're a first-time host, making sure that you form good habits so that your webinars will be, the most successful that they can possibly be. And then, like I said, we'll be finishing with a Q&A, about a 10-minute Q&A session or so. So let's get started. The 5 most common webinar hosting mistakes are as followed, and I see these a ton on BigMarker. So the first and foremost that I cannot stress enough is not testing. This means, testing out the webinar software, testing out your microphone, webcam, all of that kind of stuff that would go into, testing on the software before actually hosting. That's going to be a huge factor in your success, especially for the live webinar hosting. Number 2, not practicing. So kind of similar to not testing, but in the realm of your actual content. So making sure that you have a good grasp on what you're going to say and how long you're going to say it for and all that kind of stuff. Make sure that you are definitely practicing beforehand. And then also number 3, making sure that you stick to an agenda. So not sharing too much content, not going over the time limit, making sure that you have a really concise kind of vision for your webinars. Number 4, not targeting a specific enough audience. So again, making sure you have a target market. That's going to be a big factor in your success. And then number 5 is engaging your audience, or rather not engaging your audience is a common mistake. So, fluffing up your webinars with engaging things like Q&As or polls or, anything that's going to continue to kind of increase engagement during the webinar is going to make for a more successful webinar. So let's just get started in the not testing. Mistake number 1. In terms of the checklist, like I said, this is your priority number 1 because this is going to go into the direct success of, or even being able to put on a webinar. So forget the content, forget everything else. When you get to your webinar, you want to make sure that it goes on without a hitch. So testing is going to be kind of broken down into a few really specific parts. The first is the webinar software. So with that, with anything that you do, before you actually do it, you're going to want to actually vet through everything and make sure you're familiar with it. Webinar software is no different. So you really need to get familiar with the software, know where everything is and how it works. So, if I want to be able to share my webcam and my screen, I need to go in and see exactly how that is and, how to do it in the system. A great thing that BigMarker offers is that, we do one-on-one demos as well as group demos so that you can actually get a feel for the software itself and find out where everything is. And, even features that you don't know exist, you'll be able to find out in those demonstrations. Also, if you just want to test on your own, make sure you're doing a very thorough job. We also have blogs on our webinar guide blog, which will give you more information on exactly what to test when you're looking through that. Another big thing in the webinar software space is testing out for your system requirements. So making sure that your browser is up to date, that you are on compatible compatible computer. BigMarker doesn't have any restraints in terms of I've had people say that Linux is not compatible with other webinar softwares or certain computer types like Mac or PC or something. So that's not really a big issue on BigMarker, but if you are hosting webinars on other platforms, it is really important to vet the system requirements to make sure that you are, going to be all set for your webinar and you don't have any surprises day of. The next thing that's extremely important to test is any content that you would be sharing. So whether that be your microphone, perhaps you have an external or an internal microphone on your computer, it's really important to go ahead and test those out and make sure those are working. Same with your webcam. So if you plan to share your own video, making sure that those are going to show up nice and clear and you know exactly how to do that on your webinar. And then in terms of forms of content, so again, like I said, if you're sharing your screen or if you're sharing files or videos, you have all this opportunity to share content, really making sure that you test it and it looks and sounds and it acts exactly how you want it to so that you don't have any surprises when the webinar actually starts. Another big thing is testing out your internet speed and also doing a net scan. I provided a few really helpful links here, and I'll actually get the links for you that I can post in the chat because those are not clickable. So the first is speedof.me, and this is my personal favorite speed test. A speed test measures your internet speed, meaning your download and your upload speed. And as a host, it's really important to have a higher upload speed more than anything, because if you think about it, you're kind of uploading content into the universe, and then your audience would then be downloading the content. So the download speed for your audience is more important. So it's always good, a very good idea to at least check your speed beforehand. If you can plug in directly, like to a hardline internet connection rather than Wi-Fi, it's just going to give you a more stable connection. But either way, even if you're on Wi-Fi, that's okay. Just make sure you're testing your speed, and if you can, try to get 10 megabits per second and above for your upload and your download speed, you're going to have a really, really good hosting experience. And if you're not, you might want to check out some Help Center articles or, what you can do to improve your speed. Or also, if you do have a lower speed, perhaps you're in a more remote area or you're in a country that is, notorious for having lower speeds, whatever the kind of case may be, just trying to make the best of the situation. So for example, webcams take more bandwidth than sharing just your web microphone. So you might want to kind of tailor your presentation around what you can do based on your test results. The next link that I wanted to share is this NetScan link. So the NetScan essentially allows you to understand if your computer is essentially up to date. So it's going to not only take a bunch of information from your computer, such as, the computer type, the browser that you're on, your location, things like that, but it's also going to vet if you have anything blocking your computer. So if you're behind a firewall, perhaps, or something that could be blocking the ability to host that webinar, you'll be able to see that, and you can always contact support@bigmarker.com or something like that if you have any questions, if you see any of those red X marks and you get a little worried. So again, that's just support@bigmarker.com. Or if you're using another webinar provider, you can contact their support as well. I'm sure they would be happy to help. The final kind of piece to the testing mistake that a lot of people make is that if you have guest presenters or co-presenters or people who are going to be co-hosting your webinar, it's absolutely a must to also go through these testing kind of pieces with them and make sure that just as you're testing the system, that they test everything as well. Perhaps not getting as familiar with the software, maybe you just want to say, hey, to share your files, click here, maybe you can vet it a little bit more for them. But in terms of testing their microphones, their webcams, their internet speed, all of those are extremely important to making sure that not only yourself, but your co-hosts are prepared and ready for that webinar. Moving on to mistake number 2 is obviously not practicing, and we kind of covered that a little bit earlier, but I have a few key tips that I really want to share with you in order to make sure that you're really well prepared. So just with any presentation that you are hosting, whether it's in person or in a webinar, what have you, Winging it is never a good idea. You know, it's going to provide a lot of room for error. It's going to, you know, maybe not sound as polished. There's a lot of things that could go wrong with just going and winging it with your webinar. So my recommendations are to definitely make an agenda and follow it. And then also have some key speaking points as well. So, you know, I laid out exactly what I was going to talk about in today's session early on, right? So you knew exactly what I would be talking about. And I also laid out a time limit as well. So you know exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Also, I'm sharing my key speaking points so that when you leave today's session, you know exactly what we talked about. And if you were taking notes, you have, you know, your key notes that we've kind of gone through. And also, you know, in terms of winging it and having this kind of presentation ready and things like that, you really want to run through your entire presentation at least once. You know, it does seem like work, but if you remember back to, you know, high school, college, whatever, when you had a presentation, even if it was the night before and you were kind of scrambling to put everything together, it's going to make everything sound so much more cohesive if you just go through it once and kind of vet it and make sure that you have everything a little bit more polished, just to make sure that you sound as good as you think you do in your head when it comes out and when you're speaking. And then another note about guest hosts. So I keep kind of bringing up this guest host, this you know, co-hosting a lot because, you know, a lot of times webinar hosts or, you know, webinar presenters, they do either like panel discussions or, you know, meeting style formats or just have a bunch of co-hosts that would be, you know, on the webinar. So I always like to bring this up as a point because it's really just as important for you to understand and practice and test and everything like that as it is for your co-hosts. So the first kind of point that I want to make is practice your speaking order. Let your co-host know ahead of time when they will be speaking because you don't want to have that awkward like, ooh, is it my turn? Is it, you know, whatever. You want to have a very clear agenda so that they can follow it and be, you know, in the loop just as well as you are. And again, discussing the webinar agenda with them. So in addition to practicing the actual speaking order, telling them exactly what needs to be said in exact times so that they can follow it and they can kind of meld their script, their, you know, presentation, whatever they're doing around the agendas to make sure that it's going to fit your needs as well. Number 3 is hosting a Q&A session. You know, if you're planning to host a Q&A session, which I always recommend at the end of your webinar, it provides great feedback and it's just a really good way to wrap up your sessions. Really vet who's facilitating this Q&A. Do you have a moderator? Do you have somebody who would be kind of coming in and facilitating this Q&A session or feeding certain hosts certain questions? You know, you need to make sure that you have everything down to a T so that when you're hosting this, you're not kind of scrambling at the last moment to either if you have co-hosts telling which co-host to answer which question, or, you know, you just want to make sure it's quite polished. And also, speaking on the importance of canned questions, you'll see number 2 topic here for the host and Q&A section. What I mean when I say that is having some questions in your back pocket that you've practiced that either you expect people to ask, or if there's some radio silence at the end and people haven't asked any questions, you can kind of pull them out of your back pocket and, you know, share them with the audience as if they're live so that it kind of stirs the conversation a little bit. It doesn't leave any pregnant pause between your presentation and the Q&A section. You know, it's going to be a really cohesive experience. So, you know, those are my tips, especially for, you know, practicing. The only final thing that I like to throw in there is preparing a little bit for the unknown. So obviously the unknown means that you're not going to know what happens, but you can at least kind of anticipate things like tech issues, co-hosts or even attendees kind of going rogue. When I mean that, I'm saying like, what's your policy or you know, your prevention policy against perhaps you have an attendee that's kind of getting really chatty and distracting your audience, or perhaps you have a co-host who starts rambling for 20 minutes when they were only supposed to speak for 10. You know, having some of that kind of in place, at least for an action plan, a game plan for what to do in those situations, you won't be left scratching your head in the last moment or when it's happening. You'll have essentially a plan in place. So obviously the unknown is always unknown, but it's nice to have a little bit of a protocol in place. So mistake number 3, again, is sharing too much content and then also going over the time limit. So those are kind of two mistakes kind of bundled into one. So the first is obviously sharing too much content. So it's a great way to really disengage your audience very quickly. As I was mentioning earlier, you definitely want to keep an agenda because it's going to cause, this information overload. So if you want your audience members to be able to retain the information, the content that you're sharing, and you want to keep their interest peaked, keep it short, keep it brief, and keep it really concise agenda, and really follow those agenda topics that you've created at the beginning so they know exactly what they're going to get. And it's also going to improve your scores, your ratings of the webinar. It's going to make them think twice, or it's going to make them want to register for your webinars, your future ones, without thinking twice. And then, on the flip side of that, going over the time limit, it kind of goes hand in hand with sharing too much content because you could be rambling, there's a lot of factors there. So, one thing that I like to note to people is, sometimes you do get on a tangent, you really want to chat and you want to talk about it and kind of flesh it out at length. But remember that this is going to take a time or a chunk out of people's day. They probably have it on their calendar. Like if you're hosting a webinar for 60 minutes, that's probably all they have on their calendar. And if people are really busy, it really can disrupt their schedules, and they may even have to leave early, so they could be missing out on really key points. So it's really important to stick to your time slot and make sure you're getting all of the information in that specific time period. And like I said earlier, it can be a sign of disorganization as well. If you're rambling about a certain topic, or even if you go off on a tangent, it might make people kind of like, I thought you were going to be talking about A, B, and C, but you really went on C, D, E, F for a lot longer than you went through A and B, and I was really interested about those. So, making sure everything is clear and concise is going to give you a huge payoff. And then mistake number 4, so not targeting a specific audience. And this is actually probably should have been towards the front because it's one of the first things that you should actually think about when you are setting up your webinars. So certainly before you develop your content, you really want to ask yourself things like, who should attend my webinars? Why should they attend? And what authority do I have in this space? And it's really going to wrap into the topic relevancy for your audience. So when you're developing that content, when you're developing the actual webinar, make sure that you ask yourself these really important questions. So, if I'm trying to market to housewives versus, corporate lawyers or something like that, it's going to be a very, very different crowd. And I'm going to have to think long and hard about what authority I have in that space, why they should listen to me, and, what they can get out of it. Also, it's going to cause an issue with marketing if you're not targeting a specific audience. If you're just trying to cast a huge net, you're not going to reap a huge reward. But if you figure out who you're targeting to and you think of a good way to reach them. So again, let's take this, stay-at-home moms or dads who might be home during the day and might be reachable on social media. Perhaps you have a good following on Twitter or something like that. That would be your avenue to go in, and you don't want to kind of mix that up with the other forms of content that you could be sharing, and you don't want to miss the audience that you could be reaching potentially. So, making sure that you're thinking about social media, email, if you're reaching out to, like essentially like cold calling or cold emailing, making sure that it's really relevant to those people so that you can get the most bang for your buck, reap the most rewards, so to speak. And then finally, the end results. So what do I need from my audience to make my webinar, in my mind, a success? Am I hosting a sales webinar? Do I want them to, sign up for my product or something like that? Again, you're going to need to get a strong hold on your target market in order to be successful. So, make those goals, those numbers in your head, make those a priority, and then reach out to the audience that will best get you that reward. And then finally, we have the mistake of not engaging your audience. So as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, lectures are boring. You really want to break up your webinars with content in between them. So getting attendees to weigh in using things like your Q&A sessions at the end of the webinar, as I'm doing today, or, sharing polls in between the webinar if you're hosting especially a longer tiered, or excuse me, a longer webinar, you want to break up the content so that people are going to keep their interest peaked the entire time. Another thing that's nice is that engaging your audience during your webinar is going to give for better post-webinar feedback and ratings. So, people are going to be more likely to reach out and really engage with you if they felt a connection with you. Because if you remember, we're hosting a webinar. We're not face-to-face. We can't engage in conversation, before or after. It's all very technical, if you want to call it that. So, making sure that you're giving that warm, that interaction that people are really looking for will give better feedback to you and also make people, also very satisfied, which kind of brings it into that next point. So, it definitely does improve in attendee satisfaction, and it makes them want to come back. It makes them feel like they were definitely a part of the webinar and not just, sitting at their computer watching a video, let's say. And then finally, and I think this is actually the most important, it makes the attendee feel valued as somebody who is giving up their time. They could be doing a million other things, and they came to your webinar. You really want to make them feel like not only do their questions, their opinions, and their feedback matter to you, but you're really going to address it and make sure that you are giving them your full attention. So again, using Q&A sessions, polling, anything that's going to kind of break up that content and give attendee feedback is a really great opportunity for them to essentially feel engaged. So we've gone and had just about 20 minutes of content here. As promised, wanted to keep this nice and short today so that we could kind of bring it all the way around with all of these really great mistakes and essentially how to avoid them moving forward. So we will be opening everything up to a Q&A session now. I do have a few questions that I saw coming in, so I'll get to those right off the bat. But in terms of next steps, like I said, we will be doing about 10 minutes of Q&A, and then post-webinar, for all of you who joined me today, I will be sending you that discount code as well. So thank you so much for attending today's session, and I will go ahead and start with those questions. So question number 1 comes from Laura P. What if my guest hosts aren't available to test with me? Laura, that's an awesome question, because I do get that a lot. Especially if you are hosting with like a really important or really busy guest where they're kind of like last minute, I just want to get on and go ahead with it. Even so, even if they have 0 time, which, I find it hard to believe, I think that you can probably get 5 minutes, just squeeze it right into their schedule, and they'll be okay with like a 5-minute test. Even if you can't, you'll want to send them some collateral that they can test on their own. So I'm going to, let me just grab our presenter guide. Again, if you're using another webinar software, you might want to check and see if they have a webinar guide. But on BigMarker, for presenters and attendees, we actually have guides. So I'm going to pull that up now and share the link here. 1 second. Okay, there we go. So if you want to at least send them this presenter guide so that they can test everything on their own and make sure that, and if you want to send them the links to the speed test and the net scan, and just make sure that they're at least doing those at the very, very least. Otherwise, my, gut reaction is that most people will have at least 5 minutes to get on and test. Just make sure that you plan it with them as far enough in advance on the computer that they will be hosting on for them to be able to fit it into their schedule. So great question. I know it can be a little scary, especially if you are, asking somebody with who seems very important, might be very, very relevant in the space. But it's so important to test to make sure that everybody has a good experience on the day of, and I think they'll definitely understand that. And then Jean asks, how long does a typical webinar last, and how many times should I stop to engage my audience? Okay, that's another really, really awesome question. So a typical webinar, it's really up to you, but right now in the industry, we're seeing about 30 to 60 minutes. And, previously it was about like 1 hour was the rule, but now as you're seeing in today's session, we have shorter sessions. We have, people are getting booked up way far in advance, and it's less of a commitment to do the 30 minutes. So I definitely think that those are kind of the new normal as of now. So it's up to you. It depends on the content that you are presenting, but 30 to 60 minutes is a really good bet. And then how many times should I stop to engage my audience? So the longer that your webinar is, you should probably stop, incrementally a little bit more. I would say if you're hosting a 60-minute webinar, throwing in a few polls along the way. I think the Q&A session is always best at the end because you might be covering the content and you want to make sure that you can, vet it and get through everything before actually opening it up to the Q&A. But if you're doing polling or if you want to do a quick Q&A session in between, the longer it is, the more you'd want to kind of shove in there to keep that engagement peaked. In terms of having like a smaller webinar, a shorter webinar as I've had today, I didn't really engage the audience in between because I wanted to kind of do a quick sweep of information followed by that Q&A. So it's all up to you. There's no real methodology. It's just, the longer it is, the more you're going to want to engage your audience, more frequently. Those are the only questions I'm seeing right now. As I mentioned, I will be sticking around for the full half hour today. So if you do think of anything, please let me know. You can either post your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'm happy to get to those at any time.